Welcome everybody to a pretty special panel we've got today. So we're kind of here to inquire into quite a big question, which is, are we living through the end of history, and has civilization run out of road, or is it running out of road? So this is really something we've looked at from the beginning of Rebel Wisdom, asking, what's the good, the bad, and the ugly of modernity? And what does it mean to be alive right now when it really does feel to many of us that civilization is at a crossroads? We're faced with a lot of existential risks, and a lot of the Enlightenment values that have brought us so much progress are kind of paradoxically leading us towards potential self-annihilation. So this panel discussion with our amazing guests, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, Nora Bateson, Wheal, Tyson Yunkaporta. This is very much going to be a sort of no-holds-barred inquiry, looking at what those values of progress are, what are some of the kind of tenets of the Enlightenment, and which ones might we want to, which ones do we keep, which ones are broken beyond repair, which ones need to be perhaps changed in some way. And we're going to have a little bit of fun with it, because these are obviously huge questions that no one has definitive answers to. So I want to introduce our guests, though, before we go on. So we've got, and I think regular viewers will probably be familiar with all three of our guests today. We've got Nora Bateson, who's an award-winning filmmaker and president of the International Bateson Institute, also a really great theorist, and I think one of the kind of leading figures in the systems change scene. We've got Wheal. Jamie's a best-selling author of the Pulitzer Prize-nominated book Stealing Fire, and more recently, Recapture the Rapture, Rethinking God, Sex, and Death in a World That's Lost Its Mind. And we have the amazing Tyson Yunkaporta. So Tyson's a senior lecturer in indigenous knowledges at Deakin University in Melbourne. And he's also the author of the wonderful book Sand Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. Now, the three of you have never been in dialogue together, so this is pretty exciting for me. And we're going to have because there's so many different topics to cover, we have a kind of quick fire game show format that Jamie suggested and was inspired by some conversations he and Tyson have had, and then conversations that Tyson and Nora have had. So we have this wonderful smorgasbord of big topics. But before we do that, I thought it'd be good if you guys just gave a little elevator pitch around the question, has Western civilization run out of road? And Jamie, maybe you could start with your minute or so answer to that ridiculously big question.
Well, I mean, the short answer is I have no idea, and that's a big part of why I was agitating to have this conversation. But in that last book, Recapture the Rapture, I ended up taking a default stand for saying, hey, there were the seeds of this infinite game of the win-win, accessible to all people, not just tribal boundaries or caste and class. Now, that notion, however bastardized, buggered up, and partially executed, is vital, and that we should sort of rush into this burning house fire as everybody's lobbing bombs at kind of Western civ, and protect that, and that there was something really beautiful and tender and essential and rare in that notion of all men and women entitled to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, regardless of race, color, or creed. And I held that to the point where I actually formalized it in a book, and then Tyson just knocked the legs out from under my stool and basically said that this was all just a stalking horse for colonial expansion, and was essentially a bunch of empty words and promises. And that was the germs for this dialogue for us to all get down to. So I'm in a profound state of curiosity and not knowing, but I would love it, just from the nostalgic side of me, if there really was something beautiful that could get us back to the better angels of our nature.
Awesome, thank you. And then Nora, and I forgot to mention in your intro, Nora, you have also written a really great book, Smaller Arcs of Larger Circles. And I wanted to put that question to you too. Has Western civilization, or civilization in general, run out of road?
Jamie, I don't know. I think what I'm interested in exploring is what it's possible to perceive that we haven't perceived thus far. And one of the things I'm most interested in that question is, what are the ways in which we hold each other in relationship trapped in patterns of being, ways of living that are inherently destructive? So, the thing about the last several hundred years is that the notion of civilization from the Enlightenment on has been pressed upon the notion of the individual. And that notion is maybe at the end of its road. I don't think it ever had a road, to be honest. I think it's been running on borrowed, stolen road the whole time. So what happens when we start to perceive that, in fact, this notion of the individual is deeply rife with illusion, and again, it's destructive. So has civilization reached the end of its road? Well, there's a part of me that hopes so, not because of the destruction that would bring and the systemic breakdown, but because of the possibilities of what it may be possible to be to each other, with each other, and in the world we live in.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Nora. And Tyson, you're up next. Tyson Yunkaporta.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you haven't lost your road, have you? There's just more road, endless road ahead. There's kind of space now, and I encourage it. I think Western civilization should definitely move to space. Just get up there. That'd be great. I think you should definitely move the entire operation to Mars. It would be awesome. Yeah, Jamie, I don't think it's exactly a house fire. It's like, it's not on fire. It's just like somebody walked past on the street and you didn't like the look of them looking out the window and calling the cops and like panicking and clutching pearls all over the place. I don't think the place is on fire yet. Although you did have, like, back when the house was built, some like libertarian architects who, they didn't really, it's not really load bearing, the whole thing, because it was just kind of cobbled together. And I think you got maybe one or two eyes wide shut sex parties left on the top floor before it sort of starts to crumble down. There's a bit of white ants in the walls and all that sort of stuff, but you're doing pretty good. It's doing all right. It's definitely not on fire, like just because a couple of people don't like the house. But yeah, it's just looking all right.
I never get invites to those parties, so I'm feeling really envious. So thank you, the three of you. So we're gonna shift format a little bit, and because Jamie was in many ways the instigator of this gathering and doing something as sort of mad as trying to tackle all these topics, we thought, a kind of faster format, kind of game show style would be fun. So Jamie, I'm going to hand over to you to kind of MC that process, and then after that we'll go into a Q&A. But take us through what we're going to do.
Oh yeah, so Ali and I are making the tag like professional wrestlers, and now Ali's in the ring. And so because I'm I think the most confused out of everybody, I'm just going to provide, agent provocateur kind of questions and cross examinations. But these are the three that will be playing the game, right? And so just to kind of establish context, this is something we're all aware of. Anybody who subscribes and is a part of this channel is obviously cares enough to be tracking this relatively closely. But in the culture wars, I think maybe for the first time in a long time, we are seeing a collapse of shared middling consensus and attacks from both sides of the political spectrum on the body politic, right? So if you think of the social justice, almost neo-Marxist critiques, if you think of the 1619 Project from the New York Times, you think of Ibram Kendi's critiques, or Ta-Nehisi Coates, like those kinds of things of like structural racism. This thing was a bill of goods all along. Equitable outcomes, not just equality of access. We need to restructure and forcibly dismantle systemic oppression. And on the other side, you have somebody with a rather unmuffled engine. On the other side, we have the alt-right and the sort of Bannonites of the world actually saying the entire globalist project is deeply suspect, right? And so any transnational agencies or cooperation are a direct threat. We should dismantle those and retrench to blood and soil ethno-nationalism. So we're really seeing, we're seeing that in compelling ways. So the question here is are we at the end of a beta test, 300 years of gathering data? What if we just did a timeout? What if we just said, hey, Western Civ, 300 years of experiment in our pilot, what to kill, what to keep, what to fix. So that's generally kind of the structure of what would be fun for us to get into together. And the topics that we just love to broach as subsets of Western civilization, not an exhaustive list, but at least some of the ones that seem relevant would be, number one, free markets, and not just a sort of wonky economist conversation, but literally like the almost religious belief in the myth of the free market, the sort of Adam Smith invisible hand. It's the most efficient thing. Like, so free markets, is that a good idea, badly executed, a shite idea? What's up with that? The separation of church and state, right? I mean, all human civilizations up to the French Enlightenment, more or less, were theocracies, and there are still quite a few theocracies around. So rather than just thinking, separation of church and state, Western civilization, advanced modern good, and, ISIS and Ayatollahs bad. Let's also expand that to think of the collapse of meaning and shared morality, and what are the pros and cons of that. Civil liberties and due process. The idea, to this hints at Nora's point about individualism, right? Is the idea of everybody having individual inalienable rights and the right to due process, and innocent until proven guilty, and a jury of their peers. Good news, bad news. What does that do? Privatization of property and its impact, and presumably some extent of privatization of the commons as well. What has happened when many indigenous societies and early agrarian societies had the commons? If you've heard of the sheep enclosure acts in the UK or the range wars in the US, and Tyson, I'm assuming that there is something comparable in Australia, just the fencing and bounding and demarcating of land and oceans, tragedies of the commons. The next would be just the biggie, representative democracy versus hereditary rule, or philosopher kings, or any of the, or enlightened despots, or any of the other options that have been on the table. Like, how's it going? And do we really like who we elect? And do they do good things for us? And what's that sense? Corporations as persons, right? That's another one that we can get into and touch on. Taxation, and specifically the right of a state to have sanctioned enforcement of, violent enforcement to ensure. Social safety nets. Once we broke through kin care, right? Families looking after elders. And we said there is an impersonal state that is nonetheless obligated to be looking after its citizens when they are poor, infirm, aging, whatever that would be. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Many libertarians, many blockchain enthusiasts would say it's a terrible thing. Many right-wing conservatives would say gut Social Security, bolster church care, all those kinds of things. And then finally, to kind of wrap all of these up, would be the myth, not necessarily saying it's wrong, but the myth of progress. Does history have a teleological thrust? Is this time's arrow and we're marching inexorably upwards to greater complexity, greater wisdom, greater enlightenment, compassion, care, and concern? Or is it Ouroboros, the snake that eats its tail, same as it ever was, and we're just the latest batch of monkeys to roll the dice? So that's the potential landscape. And I think I'd love to just, first of all, let's just jump in with the top of the list. So, and Ali, Nora, Tyson, what do you think about, please weigh in on the invisible hand of the free market brilliant idea for propagating maximum novelty and abundance, or horrible idea that has given us the price of everything and the value of nothing?
You got that one, Nora, to start? You want a minute?
Okay. Yeah, I think that I would ask the question, what is success in a changing world? And that's a question that's going to go right, I think, to the heart of identity and the notion of the self. And if success, of course, which is a way of learning to be in a world, a context in which the free market is writ large, that notion of success and the way that it produces a notion of self and identity is going to be implicitly and explicitly based upon the ability to gain material wealth and to essentially promote predatorial behavior and a number of other things. I mean, I don't see really how we can get to the question of free market without first looking at the other side of it, which is this notion of in what set of circumstances does that become a good idea? And how did we get into those conditions into which we sold everybody out? And maybe my other question on that would be, what can we learn from the study of addiction about how to deal with this relationship to the free market?
What's your connection there between addiction and the market as you see it?
Well, I guess the question is that we can't really live without material wealth. And yet when we pursue it, we're engaging in all sorts of processes that are not only dangerous, but destructive to each other and the world we live in. So we're double-binded. Okay, so you get to a point where you get, my 24-year-old daughter asking me, Mama, how do I be a good person? Right? How do I be a good person? Every single thing I do is drenched in the blood of hundreds of years of exploitation. I take the bus, I'm in the petroleum, I buy food, I'm looking at, terrible versions of agriculture. I buy new clothes, they're made by children in sweat lodges, they're in sweat houses, and there's no way out. And these double binds are creating all sorts of other issues. So our response to these double binds comes out in behaviors and second order sense making that is actually the trouble we're in. Where, I mean, that description that you gave of is it winning because it's innovative and creative, or is it a disaster? And I would say, the real question is, is heroin fun because it makes you feel good, or is it deadly? And that's not really the question. The question is, how do we think about what it might mean to live in other ways, and what does it even mean to know who I am in a world in which the free market is the centerpiece.
Okay, so that was a very high level reframe, right? Outside of like market pro con arguments into sort of its impact on being and selfhood and relationship to others. Yeah.
Do you want a really low level reframe?
Always.
Always. Well, I mean, I don't call it the invisible hand of the marketplace. I always refer to it as the invisible dick. And it's not, the marketplace isn't structured, by our collective ankle grabbing, responses to that. This, it's an oligarch's dick too. I mean, that's basically how it runs. That's how it's always run. I like the idea of a free market. I think it would be awesome. I think someone should try it one day. That would be really good. It would be great to see that. It would be great to see a market driven by people's, relationships in their communities, and actually where we go to in our natural human patterning, which is to mutual aid, and giving, sharing. I tell you, there's a lot of, every unit has a lot of velocity in a sharing economy that's quite localized, but then sort of syndicated out to the other regions around it, and beyond. That's what a free market would look like. I mean, I know what that looks like, because that's what we had here before, like way back, and so I think in the Central Desert they call it Ngapati is the name of the economy, the economic system, and which translates as give, and basically it's all about making relationships stronger by sharing things with each other. These things happen. It's the trade is, something that used to go right across this continent, from place to place. So you'd have greenstone from here ending up right up in the far north of Australia, greenstone right down in the south, because that's the only greenstone on the continent. Everything was traded everywhere, and all with this sharing economy, all without tokens. There was an experiment with tokens like 10,000 years ago, and it went really badly. So we have a dreaming story for that, with spiral shells that were used as currency for a while. It just ended badly. So there's a big cautionary tale in our dreamings about warning us against that kind of thing. So I guess that's the only way that kind of libertarian thing can work. But the free market as it stands, it's usually a lot of useful idiots sort of pushing that on behalf of a handful of invisible oligarchs who, are carrying around their big invisible prick. What would be my low-level take on that?
Well, and also just for everybody listening, right? Because you did a trickster play there, where you're like, no one's done a free market. I think there ought to be a free market, and the freest market of all would actually be would mirror some of the indigenous ways of gift exchange and trade. And I would just to tease that apart for folks. So I think that was, if I'm tracking you right, that was a playful tweak, but you weren't actually describing anything that we would know or refer to historically as the free market. When you were sharing about kinship, exchange, velocity of goods, meaning attached to those goods, that's closer to David Graeber's Debt, the first 10,000 years, where he says, look, in econ textbooks, everyone says they bartered until they couldn't run out of stuff, and then they created currency. Yay, and he's like, no, that's bullshit, right? The majority of things.
I love that book, except one word in the title. It should be called Debt, like the last 10,000 years. Yeah. We're human beings. We've been doing this for a long time. We're pretty good at it. It's like, it's just this recent blip, this sort of little experiment of, figuring out how a handful of arseholes can have a hell of a lot, can sort of pretty much wreck the joint and just sit on top of the mountain, and watch it all just crumble into dirt. Yeah, that's the recent part.
Don't spoil the ending.
Yeah. Oh, you already had with your background there.
All right.
You maniacs! You blew it up.
Tommy, bring it home.
All right. Yeah. So I have to preface this by saying that I'm sort of a reformed libertarian. I spent my early 20s were all really into Ayn Rand and Ron Paul, and I was very, very into it. And then I kind of drifted away from that, in part partly because of what Tyson's talking about, some similarities there. But what I'm thinking right now is, there's a complexity in it for me, because the idea of a kind of gift economy, a kind of global gift economy, is very popular in some of the circles I move in, but is, I think, untenable in some way. So some form of free market, I think, for the size and complexity of civilization we have, is important. But we don't have entirely free markets because we have monopoly laws. And if we didn't have monopoly laws, Jeff Bezos would already own everything, probably. So we have a recognition, even in very libertarian cultures, that we have to have some kind of antitrust. We have to have monopoly laws. So there is always this tension, I think, between a free market and some kind of intervention from a third party. I think, as a European, that doesn't kind of bother me. I think that's quite a healthy dynamic. But one thing I'm thinking as well is the concept of the multipolar trap is something that we've talked about, Jamie, and we've had on the channel a lot. And this is, this idea from game theory that I think you put it pretty well, Jamie, which is if someone's going to be an asshole, it might as well be me first, right? This kind of race to the bottom of, the worst possible outcome happening for the commons, because if one person defects, then it sets off this cascade of everyone behaving in a slightly worse way. What I think is interesting about that ties to what you were saying, Tyson, is that Joseph Henrich, who is a Harvard psychologist who wrote his most recent book is The Weirdest People in the World, and weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. We had him on the channel maybe about 6 months ago. He's done game theory experiments in more kin-based cultures that end differently to ours. So if you give us in weird people certain game theory experiments, we screw each other over and stab each other in the back because we're working under a different format. But other cultures have different outcomes. At the same time, it's not to say that there's a kind of that's inherently better, because as he points out, our civilization has gotten to where it is because we have systems where we can outsource our trust to institutions and then be able to do what we do. So I feel a little bit torn, because I do think that there's value in that. And I do think there's value in a free market and things like limited liability, without which we never would have taken the risks hundreds of years ago to expand. But at the same time, we expanded and fucked over a tremendous amount of people and screwed up and completely extracted from a lot of other cultures. So my short answer is, I don't know. I think some element of a free market is healthy. And I think what my main thing is, I think it's worth bearing in mind that at the scale we're at, we need something that allows that kind of flow of commerce, and something like a free market, I think, is a good way to do that.
Nice. So it sounds like if there was a theme maybe that both Ali and Tyson touched on, and Nora, yours was a higher level, frame set, but the idea of like free market sounds like a great idea. I think we should try it. So the idea of just that, what the economic philosophers, go ahead, Nora, you're going to jump in.
I was just going to add that I think, right in the center of this, again, is this question of the individual, right? So what we're talking about is the wealth of the individual, not the wealth of the community or the wealth of the relationships. And I think that's where it goes haywire again, is, you end up with Bezos. And that's where it was going. It was always going there. It's not like it made a wrong turn. It was going there. And so
that's what it was built for.
It's what it was made for. Exactly. So again, it's this presupposition that's underneath it that is promoting essentially predatory behavior on behalf of the notion of the individual. And that is not good for relationships. It's not good for family. It's not good for community. It's not good for anything that has to do with life.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what I hear you saying, Nora, is that once you take the recipient or beneficiary of economic market exchange outside of their context, outside of their kin, their community, their environment, that's where you get that's where you get the negatives. And so, Ali, you brought up the notion of multipolar traps. That's one game theoretic construct. Another one is rent-seeking behavior, right? This goes to the notion of how free is our market actually, because the people who start winning the game start calling the hand, start making the rules, and whether that's lobbying or legislation or any combination of things, you rapidly get a non-free market that's heavily biased in the favor of the incumbents. And then that squelches. And I mean, Elon Musk, famously said a few years ago when people were critiquing solar subsidies for renewable energy. He's like, look, I'd be happy to do away with all of them, provided oil and gas did away with theirs. But so we're in this kludgy situation. So I think that there is a deep and real question as to whether we've ever experienced a free market, or whether we just discuss back and forth kind of ideological abstracts, of this hypothetical free market, which sounds fantastic and does all sorts of things that the invisible dick that Tyson was alluding to ends up getting us in the end. Maybe we need to combine the invisible hand with the invisible dick and have the invisible reach around, and then they'll be happy. and we can get back to a civil society. All right. Well done.
They can just sit up on Mars in the corner with their hand and their dick and just
there we have it. There we have it. All right.
Yeah.
So next round, we are going to go, and I'm tempted, Nora, to go into your notion of individualism because that's such a rich topic. But let's keep it in mind and see if it shows up again. This one will be the separation of church and state, right? So central to modern Western European democracies, ending the European wars on religion, specifically the unique history of the American colonies, Rhode Island, Maryland, the ideas of freedom of religion. Pretty darn novel at the time. And the idea of never the twain shall meet, you shall not have a theocracy, because then that unfairly biases a citizenry or a populace for one faith and not the other. It's done all sorts of wonderful things as far as tolerance, inclusion, diversity of belief. And at the same time, few folks would disagree that we are having that collapse in meaning. As Nietzsche famously said, everybody knows his line, God is dead, but very few people remember the rest of the paragraph, which was, and be careful when you kill your gods, because when you kill the Christian God, you take out all of Christian morality underneath it. Like the fact that we treat each other well is by no means guaranteed, right? And having a faith in some higher order of power, at least from Nietzsche's point of view, was essential for civic order in general, raising the stage of our decency out of game theoretic ditches. So what do we think? And again, into the culture wars today, this is a very alive conversation, right? The whole middle America that has been weaponized by Trump and company, right, are nominally feeling like these are values we hold. They are traditional Christian values, family, sexual propriety, community orientation, deference to a God, all those things. Now, all sorts of buggered up things in the mix there, but there is a truth there. Right, that it compared to Nora's highlighting of individualistic, consumer, extractive society, there's something that's been eroded. So, what do we think? Separation of church and state, good idea, and we absolutely should just keep with it as is. Brilliant notion, but needs some distinct modifications, or terrible, and actually we need a postmodern theocracy to fix what's happening.
Well, it comes back to what Ali was saying before. I mean, weirdly, it's about these issues of scale, I guess, and the multipolar trap. What happens when you start to decide? For only like a century or so, these nations have existed. The idea that you can have one huge sovereign entity that has millions and millions and millions of people in it and all speak the same language. And they all have to be vaguely alike in thought, word, and deed in order for that thing to function properly, in order for there to be standing armies, for there to be, factories, general kind of industrial progress, all the rest. You need this. In order to do that, you need your priests and your kings. Priests and kings work together. That's what the golden age is all about. That thing that, the eugenicists stole from the East, those 4 ages, and they're cyclic and they go round and round. And
just tell us, just give us that map, the priests and kings.
All right. Well, Bennett's a bit of a student of this one as well, but there's that idea: you have your golden age, silver age, bronze age, and then your just dark age of horror, which is, people sort of, collective, and there's equality and all that kind of stuff. And that's the dark age. And Jamie, you got to have your rapture in there in order for it to come full circle back to the gold age again. You've got to get back to the great again phase of that golden age, and you've got to get through that dark age. But in order to do that, you need a massive disruption. You need a massive apocalypse in order for that to happen. So, that's how you get all your accelerationism, et cetera, et cetera. There's a reason that this pattern is a religious pattern, not a spiritual pattern, but a religious pattern. And that's, what religion is. That's what church is. It's a institution of governance. Always has been. The other book you mentioned, Ali, that the Henrik's book, it talks about that it's the church that created the weird. It was the church that changed the structure of families, changed marriage laws in order to turn people into individuals, coming back to Nora's individualism point, who could be extracted from. And then that paves the road for Protestantism, where all of a sudden you bang a note on the door and everybody has the right to have a one-on-one relationship with God that's not mediated by the priestly class. And so everybody's reading. You get printing press, you get the invention of cancel culture, by oligarchs trying to cancel Catherine the Great.
Wait. We're hopscotching across time and space here. We got Martin Luther, notes on doors. The cancel culture with nary a hop, skip, and a Gutenberg in between.
That's it. We go right there. It's all cancel culture is ancient. Cancel culture is like the first cancellation was of the Jews and Catherine the Great, because Catherine the Great wanted to end the feudal system, and people were getting really angry at the oligarchs, so they had to redirect people's ire towards the Jews. And so they just cancelled both of those things. And that's how cancel culture was invented. And it came right through. It was an instrument of oligarchs and the right, if you like, whatever the hell that is, right the way through to when it was still being called, remember when it was called being Dixie checked or being Donahued? Remember that? If anyone spoke out against the Iraq War, France,
back in those great days.
Yeah, France was cancelled for that, and it's only very recently that the left has begun experimenting with cancel culture. But separation church and state. Look, you can't.
Can you have an amoral government that can govern effectively?
It's really no, but you can have just people who go to church on Sunday and selectively do their morality. They can be giving to the poor at the church, and then going and just absolutely cutting off and starving like 10,000 people the next day. But that's not the message they're getting. They're getting the messages in church that that's going to influence their not just influence, it's going to drive their behavior. You understand this from your book Recapturing the Rapture. If you're having a rapture ideology preached to you in the church, then you're going to go full accelerationist. You're going to be longing for that wiping clean of the slate. And you're going to be legislating and you're going to be making decisions in government that are pushing you as close to the brink as possible. That's going to be hastening the end. I don't think the West is afraid of its demise. I think it's longing for it. It's got a death wish. Wants to wipe the sweat. That's how you make America great again. That's how you get back to the golden age. You got to everything's got to be on fire first. The house has to be on fire. Then you can have your
full Dr.
reset.
Strangelove is what you're saying.
Yeah. It's I don't know. It's very weird, and you have to jump around. You have to jump around through deep time with that one. I didn't even get started on the Dutch from 500 years ago, but we'll get there eventually.
Fucking Dutchies. Tell you what.
Yeah.
All right. It's not just the tulips. It's the Congo. Remember. And they're tall and strangely Germanic in their bearing. All right. So anyway. All right. So Tyson's just weighed in on separation of church and state. It sounded like there were some themes there of, in some respects, human fallibility and hypocrisy and inconsistencies within whatever system it is. Nora, how about your take? Can we have a just society, aka the governance part, that explicitly abdicates from a morality or adherence to a higher power, kind of wrestling with that Nietzsche question and be careful of killing your gods?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a question about metaphor and the use of metaphor. And again, this comes back to how it is we're learning to be in our world, and what are the stories, what are the metaphors we live by, right? And the idea of separating church and state has within it the implication that you could somehow separate imagination or this otherworldly paranormal world, this celestial world, from reason and law and justice, and that these things should be separated. But of course, they can't be separated. You cannot separate your intellect from your heart. You can't separate the ideas that and the dreams that you live within from the way you live your day. And so it's an illusion. To Tyson's point, I think that we could ever really have a separation of church and state. And one of the things that is lost, that is important, is, and this is especially true on do we call them the left, the center left, that there is a loss of understanding metaphor and its uses. And the right seems to be better at this. I remember when Hugo Chavez got up on the steps of the UN after George W. Bush had spoken, and he said, the first thing he said, "I can still smell the sulfur." Right? And this was one of the first times that I actually saw somebody make a critique of the right at the same level of metaphor that the right is implementing all the time. And so the loss of metaphor is a loss of understanding and participating with the whole human being and the human being's relationship to life, which is going to include it's going to include a way of making sense in multiple contexts simultaneously. To do that, you need poetry, you need art, you need ceremony, you need to be able to have some way of being in the complexity of life, where things are not sewn up and tightly defined and measured and locked in. And that's the job of the state, to lock it in, to have it be defined, to in a sense, utilize reductionism to create structure. And so there's a loss. And so my question would be, I don't know what to do with this one, because there are people who are really good people. In my experience, their religion didn't really cause that. It's their relationships with the people around them. And I've been around Zen masters that were diddling their students, and certainly the church has not got a clean slate. And so my feeling is, I'm not sure that religion makes people better. I don't know that I completely am down with that. But it does give a language and a set of justifications and a shared sense of belonging, which is nice, except for the other side of belonging is exclusion. And that's dangerous too. So there is something larger. And for me, again, it I'm going to just harp on it again, but like, what is the self? Where's the edge of you? If personal development is attached to spiritual development, is the work of the individual, you're going to lose that notion of the self actually being 400 trillion organisms and stories that go back thousands of years, and relationships and culture and language. And are you? When you're developing you and having a spiritual enlightenment of you, is it you? I'll just leave it there.
Hey, Jamie, just really quick, before my kids started playing up, I was actually going somewhere with that before, the cancel culture thing. I was trying to draw a parallel between that and excommunication and anathema, by the way. So you can't escape the patternings of spirit, however you're coming to it, is going to come to anything where you're having to make ethical judgments, etc. And particularly when you're getting all upset and antsy about things, that's where you're going to go to. So I was trying to draw a parallel between cancel culture and excommunication, anathema. If you look at the way everybody approaches all their political ideologies, it is almost religious. There's a lot of cultish behavior going on. And I don't think I know an ideological tribe that isn't behaving like a cult. I can't think of one off the top of my head. There's a lot of people looking into that. Incidentally, Rebel Wisdom has got a good report card on people who look into cultish behaviors in in this sort of corner of the internet.
It's a false flag, Potemkin village.
Rebel Wisdom is like, the slate's clear. The most rigorous people have looked into it, and it's like, no, not a cult. So well done, Rebel Wisdom, for being the least shitty corner of the IDW.
Thanks.
There we are. And damned with that faint praise. Over to you, Ali.
But actually, funnily enough, Tyson's previous comment was a wonderful segue to what I've been thinking on this. So this idea of not being able to, there's certain things we can't escape. And I think the sacred is something that cannot be removed from society. And when I say cannot, I mean because it's an intricate part of being a human being. And there's a kind of thread in sociology, starting with Durkheim, and then more recently Jeffrey Alexander, whose whole part of their argument is the sacred is everywhere in culture. So if you separate church and state, and you separate out what was the institution holding the container of the sacred for all of its ills, that is one of its functions, the sacred still plays out everywhere. Like Tyson was just saying, it's in our ideologies, it's in identity. I think we've made identity sacred. And I think part of what happens when we separate church and state in the wrong way is that we make all the wrong things sacred, because nobody is holding the container of what should be sacred and what shouldn't be sacred. So it ends up being 4chan and 8chan who have as much say over what's sacred with Q drops as any kind of institution with thousands of years of history and inquiry into metaphysics, which is a bizarre situation to be in this time of history. So, for me, the separation of church and state in terms of the power dynamics and the incentives of a bad church is a good thing. But I think, like you kind of started the point with, Jamie, like when you get rid of that, you create this tremendous void, which is something we've explored loads on Rebel Wisdom. And I'll finish this by my own little pet controversial theory that I don't share very much, which is that I think our best hope is a global nature religion. I think our best hope is a new religion for getting out of the mess we're in. And I think that kind of end of our running out of road is because we need something that creates that level of cohesion. And the reason I think it should be a nature religion is because nature can hold all of our projections. Nature abhors gurus because it is kind of the transcendent guru, and it takes us right back to where we began, and it humbles us. So now, of course, as soon as we started having a global nature religion, some dickhead's going to try and take it over. But my kind of deepest fantasy is something that was, kind of brought us to this kind of ego dissolving return to nature, because that void has to be filled in a healthy way, I think.
We can always pop him in a wicker basket and burn him on the solstice, right?
Yes,
that'll level the scales. Fantastic.
Well, if that's how you do it, in your place, then good on you. It does have to be. There does have to be a lot of diversity, though. And this is the problem. See, my problem is with nations. The idea of these massive nations, they just don't work. They're not clunky. That's the experiment that needs to be revised. If things are broken down into smaller regions, I think you'll find that most of the most of the ideas that the Enlightenment is trying to do, which was built in a time of a more smaller regional kind of world. I think they'll probably work a little bit better. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Hey, and you mentioned Valentine's Day. You mentioned 4chan, so I have to do a bit of a shout out to all the incels out there. Must be doing it tough today. Have a happy Valentine's Day. What do they do on Valentine's Day? Is it just deep fake AOC porn,
wanking.
Or
that's it? That's
like,
just all that's going on.
Hentai, happy hentai.
Yeah. No.
Who was Saint Valentine, and what did he do? By the way,
there were two of them. They were executed within a few years of each other. And it was, and then sort of repurposed by the church after a sort of Roman bacchanal where people were randomly assigned to each other to shag for the duration of the holiday and then stay together if they had some chemistry.
All right. I think there's some things there that are worth keeping. What do you think, Nora?
I hope they have a very nice evening. I don't know. It's I don't know. Like, seriously, I've been thinking about this the whole time we've been talking about what's so great about Western civilization. And, like, I know that there's beautiful things that have come out of it. I'm not going to deny that. But I also we have to admit that it's been very destructive. And that's true for most people. I mean, most women have been raped. So, like, is this working for us? Like, what are the underpinnings of this that are actually in play? And how do we think about being in another way? Which for me is the question, how the hell do you get out of it? Because it's not like you're going to just hit a reset button. Somehow there's got to be a learning that is embodied of how and why and what it feels like to have drunk the poison that we have been in. And it's
Nora, just a clarifying question there.
Yeah.
When you were describing sexual violence as like, hey, this is a litmus, this has to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
Is that a critique specifically of modern Western civ, or is that human sexual politics and
it would be foolish for me to pin that specifically on Western civ, but let me just say it didn't help.
Why? What's your sense of what did it exacerbate or undermine?
I mean, I think what is exacerbated is the sense of what it takes to be successful, of what, who you have to step on, a sense of a numbness that is required to those relationships and that mutual aid that Tyson was talking about. There is a desensitizing that is necessary. And taking part in that is, well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like maybe I shouldn't have brought all that up, but I did. So
no, you got to bring it up. You got to bring it up, Nora.
It's here
because incels. That's the other thing they're going to be doing on Women's Day is fact checking your claims about sexual violence. But look, I mean, that's on this continent. Rape has always been a capital offence. And you would definitely get speared for it because, everybody knows what you've done and boom, you're definitely going to get speared. But it's just, I know, sorry, you want to keep going. It's just that, I'll come back to it then. It's this idea that you can't trust this law, that they put these laws there and say, no, it's okay. We're going to take away your right to protect yourself, but we're not going to protect you. We're going to take away your families, your community, everything else. You'll all be individuals, but it's all right. You'll be protected. But you're not. Women are not protected here, and the law always says one thing, but it does another. We're supposed to believe in this jury system, but, our Aboriginal communities here don't get a jury of our peers at all. And we're, like 1% of the population, but, most of the prison population. Yeah. most of them in jail for non-payment of fines or really minor things going on. Our prison population here, it's we don't believe you, like the people who
I'll tell you
aren't
what,
you,
right?
we don't believe you. We're forced to live under this law that doesn't do what it says it's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
We're all doing really well, and then you come along and you wreck all that, and then you say, hey, no, but we're going to bring you the gift of human rights. We're going to bring you this rule of law, and it's going to make you safe. It's like, no, I think, half the world's population, women, are going to disagree with that. And that's great. I'm sure you can find me some clips of women who don't agree with that. And that's awesome. But sorry, Nora, for mansplaining your business for you there. But I really thought you were done.
This is a nice wrap up, right? Because you've just come back, Tyson, to the central nub that was our conversation 6 months ago, which is, are any of these highfalutin ideals, whether it's libertarian invisible hands or representative democracy or the benefits of Western civ and white man's burden, blah, 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 is any of it legit and worth defending, protecting, updating? Or is it a bill of goods? So for our final kind of lightning round, I would love to kind of go back to checking in with the three of you on, and this is where Nora, I think, chimed in a few months ago with a tweet, didn't you? You said something along the lines of developmental theory is colonial as fuck, something like that, right? And then I, and then there was a response ensued, right? So the question here is what about the myth of progress? That you can take this back to the French Enlightenment. You can touch in inevitably on Francis Fukuyama's End of History, and in the late 80s, the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Is representative democracy and free market capitalism the pinnacle and indefinite steady state for human civilization design? Right? Or is that propaganda to mask a totally more violent and aggressive and extractive agenda? And are we on time's arrow, progressing towards whatever, enlightened star beings, or are we in cyclical history and we're just about to be grist for the mill and turn back into compost like every other civilization before us? So, myth of progress, yay or nay, and why, in 3 minutes each. And Nora, since you were in between conversations, let's start with you.
The myth of progress runs deep, and it's deep in language. It's in the way that we would express the ends and the means, the instrumentalization of what a strategy or a goal or a plan is. It's everywhere, and so it's not only some abstraction of an industrial philosophy. It's deep in how we perceive, I'm going to go to school and get an education so I can get a job. There it is. And as living organisms, we have to figure out how to be in our contextual reality. It's what we have to do. And that is a physical process, but it's also a cognitive process. And so, as when you ask a kid, like, what are you going to be when you grow up? And that seems like a cute, friendly question to ask them. And somehow those little tiny children know. They know. They pick a profession. They've already worked out that when you grow up, you get a job, you become a this or a that, a doctor or a lawyer or a podcaster or whatever it is. And they're working out how to become into the context of their lives. So, we can't underestimate the way in which this myth of progress is infiltrating that entire process. And it's making it really difficult to pay attention to those things that don't have a payoff on the game card of progress. Things like care. things like taking care of being in nature in a way that isn't destructive. Things like agriculture that doesn't produce huge yields and profits. Things like ways of being in the world that don't measure up on our notion of progress. And most of those things exist in the very deep needed raising of children, taking care of elders, making food, living life in the relationships that we live them. So, I guess we could redirect the myth of progress so that the progress could be that maybe in the future we have a more relational goal. But my sense is that if you take that thinking and you replant it into that kind of goal, you're going to screw up again. And what you're going to get is actually a perpetuation that just has different vocabulary on it. And so that's I think, a real danger of setting goals and strategies and linear progressions toward a potential way of being together that is actually not based on those things. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So it sounds like, if I'm hearing you, is the sort of the collapsing of time into time's arrow, beginning, middle, end, the track of progress is destructive and sometimes antithetical to valuing care and concern in a, whatever, in an intact system, in something that is outside of a march towards someplace else.
It's destructive to some things and not destructive to others. And that discernment seems to be beyond most of us.
Great. All righty. Ali.
Yeah, I think there's a thing to unpick for me, which is around the concept of progress overall, and the idea, like John Vervaeke points out, that after the axial revolution, there was a shift from that more cyclical, flowing understanding of time towards a more kind of historical idea of progress. A lot of what Nora was just talking about, like, I think he points out that phrases like, where is this relationship going, would have been sort of completely nonsensical to someone 3,000-4,000 years ago. Now, part of his argument is that is so deeply embedded in what he calls the grammar of our thought that it is quite difficult to get out of, which Nora is talking about. I think it's so difficult to get out of that we don't have much hope of reframing our worldview to such a degree that we can go into that more flowing cyclical way of seeing things. And so for me, I think I like Terence McKenna's idea that we need to have a forward escape, right? We're not going to be less progress driven. So we need to know what we're progressing towards. And I think the idea of what it is the part of the meaning crisis, I think, is a complete void of what we're moving towards. What are we living for? We have the pursuit of happiness, which is such weak sauce. It's like, happiness as a value to pursue is incredibly shallow, and it's obviously not working because it doesn't deep enough. It doesn't have a kind of sacred richness. So that's kind of where I land on it, is that it's the sort of re-enchantment of the world and the return to some sense of what is worth dying for, what is worth living for, as a group of people, not just individuals. So that's, I think, where the big missing piece, or a big missing piece, is what's worth progressing toward, and what does it look like when we get there? Because I think we have absolutely no idea as a civilization.
Nice. All right. Well, Tyson Sand-Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, Yunkaporta. Bring us home on your sense of, you often speak from and refer back to deep history, long arcs of time, certain sort of senses of timelessness and the being in relationship to place, self, and culture. What's your sense of the Western Enlightenment and progress? Are we including developmental models, right? I mean, Nora, you may be played out on commenting on that one, but that notion of, are we getting better, smarter, kinder, more compassionate, more inclusive, or was that just kind of the press clippings of an ascendant combustive civilization that's just about to blow out?
I reckon all the yeoman farmers that invented all this sort of stuff, when they got together, they probably enjoyed what they were doing on the farm more than they were enjoying, the rest of it, writing constitutions, hot, dark room with like too much cider. That must have been really crappy. Look, I guess you just gotta look out for like the structural ideological baggage that gets brought through with things. There's pretty much nothing new right now. Everything is something from before that's just rebranded. So, I think what Nora was trying to get to, which you can't do in a tweet, just from my understanding, the hours and hours that we've spent together, it's like the developmental theory, all the rest of it. It's all good and it sounds good, but it's really just a rebranding of the great chain of being. It's basically just look, everything, all we've got on the menu is a bunch of gamified hierarchies right now, that sort of suck you into it and like, look, if you can like just externalize all the things that Nora was talking about before, which, just in the context of this conversation, even makes me want to roll my eyes when she talks about looking after old people and children. I'm like, oh yeah, whatever, we're gonna get back to the game. Gotta get back to the game with Jamie. It's you've got to be in there. You've got to externalize these things. You've got to, if you bend your back to the wheel, if you burn your life, then you can level up and level up and level up. And it's so structural. Like what I was mentioning to Nora about Steiner schools. You couldn't get any more hippie and lovely than that. But there's that whole thing of they can't read until their milk teeth come out, and that's kind of nice that you're not like making them literate too young. They get a chance to develop. It all sounds really deadly, but that's actually there because the idea is that in their previous incarnation, they would have been in a lower race, and that lower race, like that survives into your milk teeth. And it's not until the milk teeth drop out that you fully come into your current incarnation as you progress through the color levels towards this, what used to be called Aryan, but now is called Indo-European, because that got rebadged as well and rebranded. It's just,
Are you problematizing really Steiner? Shitty, what the hell's happening here? I thought this was a safe space. I just wanted to knit with woolen things.
I'm just saying, like, this lovely thing, Steiner, like that. It's like some eugenics shit. Everything is like a very thin paint job over the master's house, and that's what we've got. And here now we've arrived with the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, but he doesn't live there anymore. He would love for us to tear down his house because he'll make more on the insurance than he would if we sold it, And he doesn't live there. His nephew lives there, and he's doing ayahuasca in there, and he invites us in and says, "Yeah, come sit down." And I don't know. It's just all weird, Jamie.
That by the way, that was the most fecund riff and bent metaphor I've heard from you for a while. The paint job over the master's house. He's not even living there. That could be unpacked for a whole hour as well.
Sweet. All right, it'll be a chapter in the next book. We'll get it done.
Yeah. Well, and so as we wrap up just this kind of speed round, and these weren't especially speedy. We only got to 3 topics, right? We talked about the fundamental nature of progress, the notion of markets, and the one in the middle, which was
church and state.
And there's plenty of fine-grained ones in between. I'll tell you, the one that I am baffled over lately, and if anybody hasn't read Vaclav Smil's Grand Transitions, or our mutual friend and colleague Nate Hagen's work on energy history, just that notion of any of these conversations of progress. I mean, yes, you get kind of a mulligan from 1700 to 1850, but after that, you're into coal and fossil fuel. And so any of our descriptions, which we often, like economists, just have these discussions in the abstract, like with no knowledge that we just hit the mother lode of millions of years of buried starlight and set it all on fire in a centuries-long coke bender, and that we attribute all of these things to our philosophies and to our governance and to our principles and lifting people out of poverty and all this shit. And it's just a one-off bonanza of energy extraction. So for me, the whole question of Western civ, progress or not, is one, the energy history lens, and then the other is impact on both, fundamentally anybody not in power. So Nora, you presence that with gender and women and sexual violence, and Tyson, you brought that up also with just any indigenous experience of settlers and colonialism. And these become, deeply, deeply challenging and fraught inquiries to sift through in a truly honest and comprehensive accounting. Well, I know that there's tons of folks here. There's a very live chat with questions and comments and ongoing conversations there. And so I'd love to just kind of thank you guys for all just being game and jumping into this. And clearly, as is evidenced, I'm sure, for all of us and everybody listening, we barely scratched the surface on any of this. But we'd love to turn it back over to you, Ali, to help facilitate a Q&A, and let's see what happens in this next leg of the thing.
Amazing. And Jamie, thank you for so kind of expertly stewarding us through that quick fire, not so quick fire, but really rich round. That was really cool. And I've never seen so many requests in our comment section for this to be a series. So if you're feeling that, maybe put a little +1 in the comments as well, because I think we kind of scratched the surface, and this is a great constellation of people. So let's go into Q&A. We've got about 15 minutes for it, but look at all those +1s. Maybe our guests to come back for another round at some point. So if you got a question, just do the hand raising function here on Zoom. And it can be a question for whoever, or you can direct your question towards a specific person. If you don't know how to do the hand raising function, it's down in the participants tab. Maybe Clay, you could be kind enough to remind people, because I can't see it as host. I could never figure it out. But Terry,
just a quick one for Tyson. You say that there was an experiment in using shells as currency and it didn't work. How did they put that genie back in the bottle?
Good question.
I'd have to get like a lot of permissions from that place to tell all that story or anything, but basically it was the first heist as well. So it was this Blackbird clan that they did a big heist, and they destroyed a very important entity in order to get those things. And how did they get the genie back in the bottle? I guess it was just the horror of the event of that murder and the heist. That was just, everybody just went, well, we can't touch that again. That's dirty. That's finished. And that clan was outcast. Was the impression I got too. So I don't know. I guess yeah. It doesn't. They were eventually brought back in though, because you can't. You know what happens when you push people out and they become bandits and marauders, and they can't get a girlfriend and all that sort of stuff. That's how Rome started, like that, and that didn't end well. Still hasn't ended well.
Awesome. So Ahmad.
How's it going? Hey, this is a fantastic discussion. I recently read a book by Eric Beck, who's is kind of a German late German philosopher now, sociologist. And his book is actually called Individualization. So this is actually a response to what Nora was saying about around individualism. And his whole premise is that individualization is there's a difference between that and individualism. That individualism is just kind of a market narrative that's been constructed. But what he's saying is that, because of the technologies, because of the evolution of technology and the impact, that we actually get to play out our freedoms more, and that we don't have the structures to really support that. And what it reminded me of is some of the work that Ivan Illich did a long time ago, when he really kind of critiqued some of the structures and its inability to kind of hold space for individual pursuits. So my question is that, do we think the challenge is that we have not constructed a platform for meaning making of these individual freedoms that really get to show up through our own sense of personalization? I mean, even, and I'll stop here, but even in our society and culture now, you see our abilities, with technologies to create, personalized health, just personalization throughout our whole, which does impact our sense of who we are and our pursuit of our freedoms. Is there, can that exist, and can there be a platform to support that, looking into the future?
I think there's a strange dilemma in there. And the dilemma is that in the structures that are promoting and perpetuating individualism and the illusion thereof, there is this idea that as individuals, you should be self-sufficient. Right? So everybody needs a lawnmower, and everybody needs an oven, and everybody needs their own running water, and everybody needs their own stuff so they can be individuals, right? Now, but in the midst of this, there's also the metaphor of the factory in the society, which is only possible if the parts are all working together. Right? So in order to be an individual, to have your individuated needs met, you have to be a working part of the machine, which is actually not going to promote individuation. Right? So at that point, if you start to say, yeah, but I don't want to do that. I want to do flowers, and I want to do something else. That's not actually workable. So it's an interesting sort of tension and twist there on what do we mean by individualism. And I think part of the reason that I was tossing that swipe at stage theory last summer is because I felt very passionately that it's trouble when we start to attend to the notion of development, and it's caught only at an individual level. When you're looking at each person and their arc of development, and that arc is prescripted by somebody else. Because people have to figure out how to live in relationship. And so you might learn to, do a heist if you happen to be in a world in which there's a lot of something to take, and taking is a good thing. You learn to lie. You can also learn to give. You can learn to be affectionate. You can learn to not be affectionate. So to then miss that contextual information. I guess what I'm really coming to is there's a sense of, I guess, humility. Certainly that's the core recognizing that in one way or another, all of us have come to figure out how to be in the world that we're in, and we're tangled up in those processes, those hypocrisies, those justifications that have been brewing for centuries. And are they ours? Is it my responsibility? Or is it your responsibility? Is it our responsibility? Where does that lie? To find those freedoms without hurting others would require a completely different epistemological basis. And that basis, those premises of the sort of epistemological beginning point are not going to be easy to change.
It's interesting, Nora, because when you said that notion of developmental theory, and that your problem was on the individual developmental model. And interestingly, and I don't think this is irreconcilable, but if I had to put my bets, I'd have said I feel most comfortable with the individual human development. Kohlberg, Piaget, Montessori, kids grow, they get bigger, obvious things. And my deep concerns is when people extrapolate from that onto culture and then stack rank cultures. But you were actually, you had a completely different reservation or concern about it. So I think it's just fascinating.
They're the same thing, Jamie, but from slightly different angles. Because what happens, of course, is that those arcs of development get turned into norms. And so then you have something that's normal and something that's abnormal. In other words, you have something that will fit into the factory and something that won't fit. Something that is somehow outside, right? That's how the eugenicists got involved with it, and statistics. I mean, all the original statisticians were, or many of them were eugenicists. So looking at those larger scales, it just gets more and more tricky to think about what it actually means to learn, okay? And that to me is the word that's missing tonight. I want to talk about learning next time, because it's something different than development, and learning to learn, and mutual learning. What am I learning about being in conversation with the Rebel Wisdom guys? How am I learning to participate in this right now? And I'm calibrating, I'm responding, I'm figuring out what it takes to be in a repartee with you. But this is not, in another context, I would be in a very different type of communication. So what is happening here is not necessarily all me or all Tyson or all Jamie or all Allie. It's what it was possible for us to do together. Who we could be when we were together, it isn't who we can be in the wider sense. It's who we are when we're together, what's in this relationship. And that's important, because when we talk about what changes, it's way too easy to point to the parts and say, we got to change the state. No, we got to change the church. We got to change the civil liberties. We got to change this part or that part. But for me, the real issue is the relationships. It's the relationships between all those processes and how we as people fit into those. But relationships are made of communication. And so then we could think, well, communication is what got said or what didn't get said. And we could make a transcript, and we could say, well, this is what happened, and she said this and he said that, but then she said this wrong, and then she should have said this other thing. And that isn't really what communication is, though. Communication ultimately is what it was possible to say together. And that is something we hold in our relationships. So how do we change that? Who it's possible to be together? And that to me is about learning, which is a very different concept than development.
Nora, thank you for that. That's actually, I think, such a beautiful place to draw this to a close as well. And it leaves me thinking about the particular quality of this conversation rather than just what we said. And for me personally, and I think for a lot of people who've here, all of us, it's had a pretty special quality to it. And I think part of that quality is that everyone wants more, because the chat is just going mad with people people asking for more of this, and it's my hope that this becomes perhaps the beginning of a longer inquiry. So we do unfortunately have to wrap today, but I wanted to say a massive thank you to our three guests, to Jamie Wheal, Nora Bateson, Tyson Yunkaporta. You guys have been amazing. This has been a brilliant conversation. I'll also thank you to everyone who's tuned in and everyone for your great questions. And in Rebel Wisdom fashion, I'd like to invite you to unmute yourself and say thank you and goodbye to our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Looking forward to
Thank you.